The 15th of May, 1945 arrived with an eerie quietness across the American military hospital compound in Fort Sam Houston, Texas. Dr. Heinrich Müller stood frozen behind the barbed wire fence, his Wehrmacht medical officer's uniform still bearing the dust of the Atlantic crossing. He had prepared himself for interrogation, perhaps even humiliation. Anything except what he witnessed through the chain-link barrier. American medical personnel rushed past carrying surgical trays, their faces focused not on hatred, but on the universal urgency of saving lives. When Captain Robert Anderson approached the fence and extended his hand through the wire mesh, offering not a clenched fist, but an open palm, Müller hesitated. The gesture seemed impossible after 6 years of total war. "Dr. Müller, I presume." Anderson's voice carried neither contempt nor forced politeness. "We've been expecting you. Our surgical ward is overwhelmed, and frankly, we need skilled hands." The German physician's mind reeled. Need him. The enemy needed him as a colleague rather than viewing him merely as a prisoner. As guards unlocked the gate, Müller exchanged glances with his fellow captured medical officers, Dr. Franz Weber, Dr. Otto Schmidt, and the younger Dr. Klaus Hartmann. Their expressions mirrored his own disbelief. They had heard stories from the Eastern Front, tales of what happened to captured German doctors in Soviet hands. They had braced themselves for American vengeance after years of Nazi propaganda about Allied brutality. Instead, Anderson led them not to interrogation cells but to the officers' barracks. Clean beds waited with fresh linens. A mess hall served hot food on actual plates rather than throwing scraps into bowls. But the true shock came the following morning when Anderson escorted Müller to the hospital's surgical wing. The operating theater gleamed with modern American equipment that made even the best German field hospitals seem antiquated. Anderson gestured to the scrub station. "We have 17 critical cases from yesterday's training accidents and combat injuries arriving from the Pacific Theater. I've reviewed your credentials from Heidelberg University. Your specialty in thoracic surgery is precisely what we need." Müller stood motionless at the threshold of the operating room. His hands, which had operated on countless Wehrmacht soldiers, trembled slightly. "You would trust me with your soldiers' lives." Anderson met his gaze directly. "Medicine doesn't wear a uniform, doctor. The Hippocratic Oath doesn't have a nationality clause. Our boys are dying, and you have the skills to save them. That's all that matters inside these walls." The American captain handed Müller a clean surgical gown. The fabric felt impossibly soft compared to the rough, often blood-stained coats he had worn in field hospitals from North Africa to Normandy. As he tied the strings behind his back, Müller caught sight of his reflection in the polished metal of an instrument tray. He saw not a prisoner of war, but a physician being offered the chance to practice medicine again. According to documentation preserved in the National Archives and later examined by historians researching POW medical programs, this scene repeated itself across numerous American military installations throughout 1945 and 1946. The American military's approach to captured Axis medical personnel defied everything the Geneva Conventions minimally required, establishing an unprecedented program of professional cooperation that shocked German doctors who had expected retribution. Dr. Weber approached Müller at the scrub station, his voice barely above a whisper. "Heinrich, is this some elaborate psychological torture? Do they mock us by offering hope before crushing it?" Müller had no answer. He only knew that in minutes he would stand across an operating table from American surgeons, working to save an American soldier's life. The absurdity of the situation overwhelmed him. Yesterday an enemy, today a colleague. As the first patient was wheeled in, Müller took his position, and Captain Anderson nodded to him with professional respect. The surgery began, and in that moment, two former enemies became something neither had anticipated, partners in the ancient battle against death itself. The 23rd of May, 1945 marked Dr. Müller's 7th surgery, alongside American medical staff at Fort Sam Houston. His hands moved with practiced precision through a complicated abdominal procedure on a young private named William Patterson, who had suffered severe internal injuries during a parachute training exercise gone wrong. Across the operating table, Captain Anderson worked in perfect synchronization, their instruments meeting and parting in the delicate dance of collaborative surgery. The professional rhythm felt so natural that Muller momentarily forgot the war had even happened. "Clamp," Anderson requested, and Muller handed it over without hesitation. "Suction here," Muller indicated, and Anderson's nurse responded immediately. When young Patterson's vitals stabilized after 3 hours of intensive surgery, Anderson stepped back and pulled down his surgical mask. "Excellent work, doctor. That repair technique on the hepatic artery, I've never seen it performed quite that way. Would you be willing to demonstrate it to our surgical residents?" The question stunned Muller into silence. Teach Americans? Share German medical innovations with the military that had defeated his nation? Before he could formulate a response, Anderson continued, "We've established a medical education program here. Several of your colleagues have already agreed to present lectures on their specialties. Dr. Weber is teaching our nurses advanced wound care techniques tomorrow afternoon." As they scrubbed out, Muller studied the American captain's face for signs of mockery or hidden agenda. He found only genuine professional interest. "Why?" Muller finally asked. "Why treat us this way?" Anderson dried his hands methodically before answering. "My father was a surgeon in the Great War, the First World War, I suppose we call it now. He served in France, saw things that haunted him until he died in 1938. But he always told me one thing. Medicine is humanity's greatest mercy. When you're fighting disease and death, nationality becomes irrelevant." That evening, Muller attended his first formal gathering in the officers' recreation hall. The scene bordered on surreal, German POW physicians mixing with American doctors over coffee and cigarettes. Dr. Otto Schmidt stood at a chalkboard, sketching diagrams while explaining a new approach to treating frostbite injuries he had developed on the Russian front. American military surgeons leaned forward, taking notes with genuine interest, asking technical questions without a trace of hostility. Lieutenant Colonel James Morrison, the hospital's commanding officer, approached Muller with 2 cups of coffee. "Sugar's still rationed, I'm afraid, but at least it's hot and reasonably fresh." Muller accepted the cup, noting how Morrison's gesture, offering refreshment to a prisoner, would have been unthinkable in reverse circumstances. "Colonel, I must ask, is this treatment standard across all American POW facilities?" Morrison settled into a chair, his weathered face thoughtful. "For medical personnel? Generally, yes. The Army Medical Corps pushed hard for this approach. We argued that medical knowledge shouldn't be wasted because of politics. Besides, the Geneva Conventions require proper treatment of prisoners, but we've gone beyond minimum requirements." He paused, sipping his coffee. "I'll be frank, Doctor. We also need your expertise. This war produced medical challenges we'd never encountered. New types of burns from flamethrowers, blast injuries from improved explosives, tropical diseases from Pacific combat. Your experience, particularly from the Eastern Front, provides insights our physicians lack." The pragmatism impressed Muller more than empty humanitarian platitudes would have. Americans, he was learning, had a remarkable capacity for practical thinking that transcended ideology. They saw useful knowledge and chose to harness it rather than reject it out of spite. Dr. Klaus Hartmann, the youngest of the captured German physicians, joined their conversation. At only 28 years old, Hartmann had been conscripted into Wehrmacht medical service straight out of medical school. "Colonel Morrison, I've been wondering, after the war ends officially, what happens to us?" Morrison's expression grew serious. "That's being decided at higher levels, but I can tell you that the Medical Corps is advocating for educational exchanges. Some of you might be offered opportunities to continue working with American medical institutions, sharing knowledge both ways." He stood, preparing to leave. "War is temporary, gentlemen. Medicine is forever. We'd be fools not to recognize that." After Morrison departed, the German doctors sat in contemplative silence. Dr. Weber finally spoke, his voice carrying the weight of their collective confusion. "I fought at Stalingrad. I saw what happened to our people captured by the Soviets. I expected similar treatment here, perhaps not as brutal, but certainly hostile. Instead, they offer us partnership. Miller understood Weber's disorientation. They had all been shaped by Nazi propaganda that painted Americans as ruthless gangsters who would show no mercy. The reality confronting them daily contradicted everything they had been told. Young soldiers who should have hated them instead treated them with professional courtesy. Nurses who had lost brothers and sweethearts to German bullets still smiled politely when passing instruments during surgery. The contrast tortured Miller's conscience in ways he had not anticipated. If Americans could separate professional duty from personal hatred, what did that say about the regime he had served? He had joined the Wehrmacht Medical Corps out of patriotic duty, telling himself that healing soldiers transcended politics. But had he been complicit in something far darker by lending his skills to Hitler's war machine? These questions plagued Muller as he returned to his quarters that night. Through the window, he watched American medical personnel working the night shift, their shadows moving behind illuminated windows. They worked to save lives with the same dedication he had once brought to German field hospitals. The symmetry of their shared purpose across enemy lines forced him to confront uncomfortable truths about duty, morality, and the choices physicians make during wartime. The 7th of June, 1945, brought an unexpected announcement that rippled through the POW medical community at Fort Sam Houston. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison assembled the German doctors in the hospital's main lecture hall, a space that could accommodate nearly 200 people. As Muller and his colleagues filed in, they discovered the room already filled with American military physicians, nurses, and medical students from nearby Baylor University College of Medicine. The Americans had saved seats in the front rows specifically for the German doctors. Morrison stood at the podium, his bearing commanding immediate attention. "Gentlemen and ladies," he nodded to the nursing staff, "today marks the formal inauguration of what we're calling the Medical Exchange Program. The war in Europe has ended, but the war in the Pacific continues, and wounded servicemen still need the best possible care. We have an opportunity to combine German and American medical expertise to save more lives." He gestured to a large board behind him, displaying a schedule of lectures, surgical demonstrations, and collaborative research projects. "Over the next 6 months, we will conduct intensive training sessions. Our German colleagues will share techniques developed under combat conditions, and our American staff will introduce them to recent innovations in antibiotics, blood plasma storage, and battlefield triage systems." Miller scanned the schedule and found his name listed for a presentation on Advanced Thoracic Surgical Techniques in Trauma Cases, scheduled for the following week. His stomach tightened with nervousness. Public speaking had never been his strength, and presenting to former enemies added layers of complexity he had not anticipated. After the assembly, Captain Anderson caught up with Muller in the corridor. "I know that look, Heinrich. Stage fright?" Muller appreciated Anderson's use of his first name, a small gesture that had become common among the medical staff. "I have never lectured to Americans before. I do not know if my English is sufficient for technical explanations." "Your English is excellent," Anderson assured him. "Besides, we'll have visual aids and medical terminology is relatively universal. But I have another proposal." He pulled Muller aside into an empty consultation room. "The Medical Corps wants to document these techniques on film. We're creating an educational archive for future training. Would you be willing to be filmed performing a demonstration surgery?" The request startled Muller. Film documentation meant permanent record, evidence of a German doctor working cooperatively with Americans. After the war, how would such documentation be viewed in Germany? Would it mark him as a collaborator? Sensing his hesitation, Anderson continued, "I understand this is complicated, but consider the impact. Your techniques could train thousands of surgeons, saving countless lives for decades to come. Isn't that what medicine is supposed to achieve?" Mueller thought of the young soldiers he had operated on over the past 3 weeks. American boys with faces that could have been German, bleeding the same red blood, crying for their mothers in English instead of German. "Yes," he finally answered, "I will do it." The following Tuesday, Muller delivered his lecture to a packed auditorium. His hands trembled slightly as he approached the podium, but as he began discussing the medical details, professional instinct took over. He described techniques developed in desperate conditions on the Eastern Front, where improvisation often meant the difference between life and death. He explained how extreme cold affected surgical procedures, how limited supplies forced creative solutions, how the sheer volume of casualties in Russia demanded efficiency without sacrificing thoroughness. The American audience listened with rapt attention, occasionally scribbling notes. During the question period, a young American surgeon raised his hand. "Dr. Muller, you mentioned using local anesthetics for major thoracic procedures when general anesthesia was unavailable. Can you elaborate on patient selection criteria for that approach?" The question's technical specificity surprised Muller. The surgeon was not asking about politics or war crimes. He wanted medical knowledge to better serve his patients. For 45 minutes, Muller fielded questions that ranged from suture techniques to post-operative care protocols. The discussion became so animated that Morrison had to eventually interrupt to keep the session on schedule. As documented in military medical records examined by historians researching post-war rehabilitation programs, this exchange program at Fort Sam Houston became a model replicated at other facilities across the United States, creating an unprecedented transfer of medical knowledge between former adversaries. After the lecture, Dr. Franz Weber approached Muller with Dr. Klaus Hartmann in tow. Weber's usually stern expression had softened. "Heinrich, I attended your presentation. It was remarkable. Not just the content, but watching those young American doctors. They looked at you with respect, with admiration even." Hartmann nodded enthusiastically. "One of them came up to me afterward and asked if I would be willing to co-author a paper on frostbite treatment protocols for the Journal of Military Medicine. Can you imagine? A German POW publishing in an American medical journal." Muller could imagine it because he was living through something equally improbable. Captain Anderson had already approached him about collaborating on a comprehensive textbook on combat thoracic surgery, combining American and German methodologies into a unified approach. The project would take years, extending well beyond any reasonable estimate of when the German doctors might be repatriated. That evening, Muller wrote a letter to his wife Anna back in Hamburg. He had not heard from her since his capture in April, did not know if she had survived the Allied bombing campaigns that had devastated their city. The Red Cross assured him they would attempt to deliver letters to Germany, though the chaos of the immediate post-war period made success uncertain. He struggled to find words that could convey his experience without sounding delusional. How could he explain that his captors treated him better than his own military command had during the final desperate months of the war? How could he describe the strange cognitive dissonance of being simultaneously a prisoner and a respected colleague? In the end, he wrote simply, "I am safe. I am practicing medicine again. I am learning that humanity can persist even after humanity's worst failures." The next morning brought the filmed surgical demonstration. An Army camera crew set up equipment in Operating Theater 2, while Muller prepared for a complex lung repair on a Marine who had been injured during training exercises in preparation for the anticipated invasion of Japan. The presence of cameras added pressure, but once the surgery began, Muller forgot everything except the work. Captain Anderson assisted, and their coordination had become so seamless that verbal communication was often unnecessary. A gesture, a glance, a subtle shift in position, these replaced lengthy explanations. The camera captured not just surgical technique but something more profound. Two physicians from nations that had tried to destroy each other, working in perfect harmony to preserve life. When the surgery concluded successfully, the film crew's director approached Muller. "Doctor, that was extraordinary. The way you and Captain Anderson worked together, it's like watching a perfectly choreographed performance." Muller removed his surgical gloves, suddenly aware of how tired he felt. It is not performance. It is simply medicine as it should be practiced. The 19th of July, 1945 shattered the fragile equilibrium Dr. Muller had constructed over the previous 2 months. That morning began routinely enough. Rounds at 7 o'clock, a consultation on a difficult case at 9, preparation for an afternoon surgery. Then, Lieutenant Colonel Morrison summoned all the German medical officers to his office with unusual formality. The tone of the summons suggested this was not a medical matter. Muller entered Morrison's office to find Captain Anderson present, along with 2 men in civilian suits who introduced themselves as representatives from the War Crimes Investigation Unit. The room's atmosphere had transformed from the collegial warmth Muller had grown accustomed to into something colder, more official. Morrison gestured for everyone to sit. His face betrayed internal conflict. "Gentlemen, what we're about to discuss is difficult. The investigation teams have been gathering evidence from liberated concentration camps and prisoner-of-war facilities. They're compiling lists of medical personnel who may have been involved in activities that violated the laws of war and basic human decency." Muller's heart hammered against his ribs. He thought of the SS doctors he had heard rumors about, the experiments, the atrocities. He had never been part of those programs, had served only with combat units treating battlefield casualties. But would the Americans believe him? One of the civilian investigators opened a folder. "We need to establish each of your service records in detail. Where you served, when, under whose command. We need to know if any of you witnessed, participated in, or had knowledge of medical experimentation on prisoners, execution of wounded enemy soldiers, or denial of medical care based on racial classifications." The questions continued for 3 hours. Muller answered truthfully about his service. Medical school at Heidelberg University, completed in 1934, commissioned as a Wehrmacht medical officer in 1939, served in France, North Africa, Italy, and finally Normandy. He had treated German soldiers and, when possible, Allied prisoners of war without discrimination. He had never been assigned to a concentration camp or Eastern Front medical facility, where the worst atrocities had occurred. Dr. Franz Weber's interrogation proved more complicated. He had served briefly at a prisoner of war camp in Poland in 1941 before being transferred to combat duty. The investigators pressed him on conditions at that camp, on whether he had witnessed maltreatment of Soviet prisoners. Weber's face aged a decade during that questioning. "I saw things," he admitted, his voice barely audible. "Soviet prisoners dying from dysentery, malnutrition, exposure. I reported the conditions to my superior officers. I was told resources were limited, that the Soviets were not priority cases. When I persisted, I was transferred to the Eastern Front as combat punishment for my sentimentality." The investigators made notes. "Did you personally deny treatment to prisoners?" "No," Weber said firmly. "I treated every patient I could, regardless of nationality. That is why they sent me away." Dr. Klaus Hartmann, being younger, had the shortest service record. He had been conscripted in 1943, served only in France and Germany, and had no exposure to concentration camps or prisoner facilities. His interview lasted less than an hour. Dr. Otto Schmidt faced the most intense scrutiny. He had served at a military hospital in occupied Poland that had been located near several labor camps. The investigators had reports suggesting that hospital had received prisoners for medical experimentation. Schmidt vehemently denied any involvement, explaining that he had worked exclusively in the surgical ward treating Wehrmacht soldiers and had no contact with the separate SS medical facilities that operated nearby. After the interviews concluded, Morrison asked the investigators to leave him alone with the German doctors. The silence that followed their departure hung heavy with tension. Morrison poured himself a drink from a bottle he kept in his desk drawer. A violation of regulations, he clearly felt the situation warranted. "I'm going to be straight with you. The evidence suggests none of you were involved in war crimes. Your records show consistent assignment to combat medical units, and we've found no evidence of patient maltreatment under your care. However," he paused, taking a drink, "the investigation is ongoing. There will be more questions, and I need to ask you all something directly. Do you understand what was done in Germany's name? Do you comprehend what we found when we liberated the camps?" Muller had seen photographs in Stars and Stripes, the American military newspaper. The images haunted him. Piles of emaciated corpses, survivors who looked more skeletal than human, ovens designed for mass cremation. He had read the reports about Dachau, Buchenwald, Bergen-Belsen. Part of him still struggled to accept that such things had happened, that the nation he had served had committed such horrors. "We saw the pictures," Muller said quietly. "We read the reports. I did not know, I swear to you, Colonel, I did not know." "But you suspected something," Morrison pressed. "You had to have heard rumors." Weber spoke up, his voice rough with emotion. "There were rumors, yes. Whispers about special camps, about harsh treatment of Jews and political prisoners. But the scale of it, the systematic murder that was beyond what we imagined, or perhaps beyond what we allowed ourselves to imagine. The admission hung in the air, an acknowledgement of willful blindness that implicated even those who had not directly participated." Morrison set down his glass and looked at each man in turn. "Here's the situation you're in. You're practicing medicine alongside the same American soldiers who liberated those camps. Some of them saw things they will never be able to forget. Yet they work beside you professionally because medicine demands it, and because I ordered it. But don't mistake professional courtesy for absolution. According to declassified documents from the Judge Advocate General's Corps reviewed by researchers in the 1990s, this confrontation mirrored similar conversations happening at POW facilities across the United States, as the full scope of Nazi atrocities became undeniable. Captain Anderson, who had remained silent throughout, finally spoke. "Heinrich, Franz, Otto, Klaus, I've worked beside all of you. I've seen your skill, your dedication to patients. But I've also seen photographs of doctors who wore the same uniform, who took the same Hippocratic oath, and who used their medical knowledge to torture and kill. How do we reconcile that?" Muller had no adequate answer. How could he explain the compartmentalization that had allowed German physicians to justify participating in genocide while maintaining the self-image of healers? How could he account for the moral collapse of an entire profession? "We cannot reconcile it," Muller said finally. "We can only acknowledge that it happened, that our profession was corrupted, that we failed to resist when resistance was required. I did not participate in those crimes, but I wore the uniform of an army that committed them. I treated soldiers who may have participated in massacres, by keeping them alive to fight another day. Am I complicit in what they did afterward?" The question had tormented Muller increasingly as he learned more about the war's atrocities. Medical ethics seemed simpler on the battlefield. Treat the wounded, save lives. But what were the ultimate consequences of those saved lives? How many of the soldiers he had repaired had gone on to commit war crimes? The moral calculus defeated him. Morrison stood and walked to the window, looking out at the hospital grounds where American and German medical personnel moved about their duties. "I don't have answers for you, Doctor, but I know this. The medical exchange program continues. You will continue to teach our surgeons, and they will continue to learn from you. Medicine must transcend the failures of nations. But you need to understand that you're not just prisoners of war anymore. You're witnesses to history's darkest chapter, and you have a responsibility to ensure it never happens again." That evening, the German doctors gathered in their quarters in somber mood. The day's interrogations had stripped away the comfortable illusions that had allowed them to function. They could no longer pretend the war had been a conventional conflict between rival nations. They had to confront their role, however peripheral, in supporting a regime that had committed industrial-scale genocide. The 3rd of August, 1945, brought news that reverberated through Fort Sam Houston with the force of an earthquake. Japan had surrendered following the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The war was truly over. In the officers' mess hall, American personnel celebrated with restrained jubilation, relief that the killing had finally ended, tempered by horror at the new weapon that had accomplished it. The German POW doctors watched the celebrations with complex emotions, uncertain how the war's conclusion would affect their status. Dr. Muller found Captain Anderson alone in the surgical prep room late that evening, staring at an anatomy textbook without actually reading it. The captain looked up as Muller entered, his eyes red-rimmed with exhaustion. "It's over," Anderson said simply. "No more casualty lists. No more boys dying from infected wounds because antibiotics arrived a day too late. It's actually over." Muller sat down across from him. "And now you must decide what to do with us." Anderson closed the textbook and met Muller's gaze. "The repatriation process will be complicated. Germany is occupied, divided into zones. Infrastructure is destroyed. But Heinrich, there's something you should know. The medical corps is lobbying to extend the exchange program. They want to establish formal partnerships with German medical institutions once they're rebuilt. They want doctors like you to help train a new generation of physicians committed to humanitarian medicine rather than nationalist ideology." The proposal stunned Muller. "You would trust Germans to train doctors after what we have done?" "Not all Germans," Anderson corrected, "but doctors who understand that medicine's first loyalty must be to humanity, not to any state or ideology. The world needs to rebuild more than just buildings, Heinrich. We need to rebuild trust, rebuild ethical foundations. Medicine might be where we can start." Over the following weeks, the full implications of the proposal became clear. The United States military government in occupied Germany was establishing new medical schools and hospitals. They needed instructors who understood modern techniques, but also understood the catastrophic ethical failures that had occurred. The German POW doctors who had participated in the exchange program were being offered positions in this reconstruction effort, not as prisoners being repatriated, but as partners in rebuilding their profession. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison called a final meeting with the German medical officers on the 20th of August. "Gentlemen, you have a choice. You can request immediate repatriation to Germany, where you'll be released to whatever life you can rebuild in the occupied zones. Or you can accept positions with the medical reconstruction program, which would extend your time in the United States for an additional 6 to 12 months of advanced training before returning to help establish new medical institutions in Germany." Dr. Klaus Hartmann spoke first. "If we stay, would we be allowed to correspond with our families? To send them money or packages?" "Yes," Morrison confirmed. "And we're working on a program to bring some family members to the United States if they wish to join you. The details are still being worked out, but the intention is clear. This is a partnership, not continued imprisonment." Dr. Franz Weber raised a concern that had plagued all of them. "Colonel, what about the war crimes investigations? If we accept these positions, does it imply we've been cleared of all suspicion?" Morrison's response was measured. "The investigations found no evidence of criminal activity by any of you. However, the larger investigation into medical crimes is ongoing. You may be called as witnesses if trials proceed. Your participation in the reconstruction program would not constitute legal exoneration. That can only come through proper judicial processes. But it does represent a judgment that you are men of medical integrity who can contribute positively to rebuilding ethical medical practice." That night, Muller wrote another letter to Anna, still uncertain if she had received any of his previous correspondence. He tried to explain the choice before him: return immediately to a devastated Germany where food was scarce, infrastructure destroyed, and his professional reputation uncertain, or remain in America to receive advanced training that could make him invaluable to German reconstruction efforts. He tried to convey his growing understanding that medicine offered a path toward redemption, a way to use his skills to atone for the passive complicity of serving a genocidal regime. All 4 German doctors ultimately chose to remain in the program. Their decision reflected not just pragmatic considerations about professional advancement, but a deeper recognition that they had a responsibility to help ensure that the medical profession never again served totalitarian evil. The advanced training period introduced them to medical innovations they had only heard rumors about. Dr. Muller worked extensively with penicillin and other antibiotics that remained scarce in Europe throughout the war. He studied new approaches to blood transfusion and plasma storage that dramatically improved trauma survival rates. He learned about the latest developments in anesthesia, surgical instruments, and post-operative care protocols. But the training extended beyond technical skills. The American military medical establishment was developing new frameworks for medical ethics in response to Nazi medical crimes. The Nuremberg medical trials were beginning, prosecuting doctors who had participated in human experimentation and euthanasia programs. These trials were establishing principles that would reshape medical ethics globally, concepts of informed consent, protection of human subjects, and the absolute prohibition against medical participation in torture or execution. Dr. Otto Schmidt attended one of the ethics seminars led by a visiting professor from Harvard Medical School. The professor discussed the Hippocratic tradition, but also its limitations. The oath says, first, do no harm, but it doesn't adequately address what physicians must do when their governments order them to harm. We need new ethical frameworks that explicitly prioritize patient welfare over state interests, that establish clear lines physicians must refuse to cross regardless of orders or consequences. Schmidt raised his hand during the question period. Professor, I struggle with a question. If a physician refuses orders that violate medical ethics, but his refusal accomplishes nothing except his own punishment, has he acted ethically? If I had refused to serve in the Wehrmacht Medical Corps, they would have conscripted another doctor, and patients would still have been treated. My individual refusal would have achieved nothing except my own suffering. The professor considered the question seriously. You're asking whether symbolic resistance has value if it produces no practical result. It's a profound question that philosophers have debated for millennia. My answer is this: ethics is not purely consequentialist. The state of your own soul, your moral integrity as an individual, has intrinsic value beyond practical outcomes. A physician who preserves his moral integrity, even at great personal cost, maintains the possibility that medicine can be redeemed. A physician who compromises his ethics, even for seemingly practical reasons, contributes to the corruption of the entire profession. The lecture haunted Schmidt for days afterward. He discussed it at length with Müller, Weber, and Hartmann during their evening discussions. These conversations became increasingly philosophical as the German doctors grappled with their wartime experiences and their responsibility for the future. According to records maintained by the American Medical Association and later examined by medical historians, these discussions among German POW physicians and their American counterparts contributed significantly to the development of modern medical ethics frameworks, particularly regarding the responsibilities of physicians during wartime and under authoritarian regimes. Captain Anderson organized a collaborative research project that brought together American and German physicians to document lessons learned from combat medicine during the war. The project required the German doctors to write detailed accounts of their experiences, including the ethical dilemmas they had faced. This documentation process forced them to confront uncomfortable truths about their decisions, their rationalizations, and their failures to resist when resistance was required. Dr. Müller's contribution focused on thoracic surgery techniques, but also included frank discussion of resource allocation decisions he had made under combat conditions, which patients received priority treatment when supplies were limited, how nationality and military rank influenced those decisions, whether he had ever allowed political considerations to override medical judgment. The honesty required for this documentation felt like a form of confession, an acknowledgement of moral complexity that simplified patriotism had obscured during wartime. One evening in late September, Anderson and Müller worked late in the hospital library, compiling research notes. Anderson suddenly set down his pen and looked directly at Müller. "Heinrich, I need to tell you something. My older brother died at Normandy. He was in the first wave at Omaha Beach. For months, I couldn't look at German prisoners without rage. When Morrison first proposed this exchange program, I argued against it. I said you were the enemy. That cooperation with you betrayed the memory of men like my brother." Müller sat frozen, unsure how to respond. Anderson continued, "But working with you these past months has forced me to recognize something difficult. My brother wasn't killed by Germans as some monolithic evil entity. He was killed in a war, a human institution that transforms individuals into instruments of mass killing. You didn't kill him. The war killed him. The war killed millions. And if we can't find ways to see each other as humans rather than national representatives, we'll just keep fighting wars until there's nobody left. The words broke something open in Mueller. I am sorry about your brother, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I am sorry for all of them. American, British, Soviet, German, all the young men who died because we allowed madness to masquerade as patriotism. I cannot undo what was done. I can only try to ensure it never happens again. Anderson extended his hand across the table. Then let's make sure it doesn't. They shook hands, not as captor and prisoner, not as former enemies, but as colleagues committed to a shared purpose that transcended nationalism. In that moment, Dr. Mueller understood that healing was possible. Not forgetting, never forgetting, but healing nonetheless. Medicine offered a path forward, a practical expression of the universal human dignity that war had tried to destroy. The 11th of December, 1945 marked the beginning of Dr. Mueller's journey back to Germany, after 8 months in American custody. He stood on the deck of a transport ship in New York Harbor, watching the Statue of Liberty recede as the vessel headed toward the Atlantic. Beside him stood Dr. Weber, Dr. Schmidt, and Dr. Hartmann, each man absorbed in private thoughts about what awaited them in their shattered homeland. Unlike their Atlantic crossing as prisoners in May, they now traveled with official documents designating them as participants in the German medical reconstruction program, carrying letters of recommendation from American military medical authorities. The journey took 12 days through winter seas. The German doctors spent their time reviewing the extensive documentation they were bringing home. Surgical technique manuals, antibiotic protocols, medical ethics frameworks, and perhaps most valuable, letters of introduction to American military government officials in occupied Germany. They had become bridges between former enemies, carrying knowledge that transcended the hatred that had consumed Europe for 6 years. Dr. Mueller kept touching his coat pocket where he carried Captain Anderson's personal letter, addressed to medical authorities in the American occupation zone. Anderson had pressed it into his hands during their farewell at Fort Sam Houston. If anyone questions your credentials or your commitment to ethical medicine, show them this. You've proven yourself, Heinrich. Make sure they understand that. When the ship reached Hamburg on the 23rd of December, Mueller's first sight of his hometown devastated him. The harbor that he remembered as bustling with commercial activity now displayed skeleton cranes reaching into gray winter sky like the bones of prehistoric creatures. As the transport moved closer to shore, the full scale of destruction became visible. Entire city blocks reduced to rubble, buildings standing like hollow shells, evidence of firestorms that had consumed residential districts. The military processing facility operated out of damaged buildings near the waterfront. American and British officers supervised the disembarkation of returning German POWs, checking documentation, and assigning them to various displaced persons camps, or releasing them to find their own way home. When Mueller presented his papers identifying him as part of the medical reconstruction program, the American captain processing his documents looked up with surprise. Dr. Mueller, we've been expecting you. Colonel Morrison sent advance notice of your arrival. The captain handed Mueller additional documents. These are your assignment papers to Hamburg University Hospital. It's been partially restored and is operating under British and American medical administration. You're to report there on the 2nd of January. Housing has been arranged in the medical staff quarters. He paused, consulting another file. There's also a message here. Your wife Anna is alive and registered at a displaced persons facility in the Altona district. We can provide transportation to that location. Mueller's knees nearly buckled. Anna was alive. After 8 months of uncertainty, 8 months of letters sent into the void hoping one might reach her, she was alive. The captain tactfully looked away as Mueller struggled to compose himself. Within 2 hours, Mueller found himself in the back of an American military truck navigating through Hamburg's ruined streets. The destruction exceeded anything he had imagined. Entire neighborhoods had vanished. replaced by fields of rubble where occasional walls stood like tombstones, marking where homes once existed. People moved through the devastation like ghosts, thin, gray-faced, wearing layers of ragged clothing against the winter cold. The displaced persons facility occupied a former school building that had survived the bombing relatively intact. Inside, hundreds of people crowded into classrooms converted to temporary housing. An American relief worker checked his list and directed Muller to the third floor, room 312. Muller climbed stairs worn smooth by countless feet, his heart hammering with anticipation and fear. What would 8 months of survival in this devastation have done to Anna? He knocked on the door of room 312. A moment of silence, then footsteps. The door opened and Anna stood before him. She was thinner, her face showing lines that had not been there in 1944, her hair now showing streaks of gray. But her eyes were the same, and they widened with disbelief as she recognized him. Heinrich? Her voice was barely a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might shatter the illusion. "I'm home," he said. And then she was in his arms, both of them crying, holding each other with desperate intensity. No words seemed adequate, so they simply stood in the doorway, two survivors of history's catastrophe finding each other against impossible odds. Later, sitting on the narrow cot that served as Anna's bed, Muller learned what she had endured. The firebombing of Hamburg in July of 1943, known as Operation Gomorrah, had destroyed their apartment and killed many of their neighbors. Anna had survived by fleeing to the countryside, living with distant relatives who were farmers. She returned to Hamburg in October of 1945 after the surrender, hoping to find word of Heinrich. The displaced persons registration system had been her last hope of locating him. Muller shared his own story, watching Anna's expressions shift from disbelief to confusion, to something approaching hope as he described his treatment by the Americans. "They trained me, Anna. They treated me with respect, as a colleague. I know it sounds impossible, but I learned more in 8 months with them than in 5 years of war." Anna gripped his hand tightly. "Heinrich, things are different now, people here. They're angry, bitter. Some blame the doctors for keeping soldiers alive to continue fighting. Others resent anyone who survived when their families died. You need to be careful how you speak about the Americans." Her warning proved prescient. When Muller reported to Hamburg University Hospital on January 2, 1946, he encountered immediate hostility from some German medical staff who had remained throughout the war. Dr. Ernst Vogel, a senior surgeon who had worked in Hamburg throughout the bombing campaigns, confronted Muller in the surgical ward on his first day. "So you're one of Morrison's pets," Vogel said with undisguised contempt. "Spent the war in American comfort while we operated by candlelight during air raids, while we treated civilians with third-degree burns using whatever supplies we could scrounge. And now you return with your American recommendations and your modern techniques to show us how medicine should be practiced." Muller chose his words carefully. "I spent 5 years treating Wehrmacht casualties from North Africa to Normandy. I was captured doing my duty as a military physician. What happened afterward was not comfort. It was an opportunity to learn, to bring back knowledge that can help us rebuild." "Knowledge?" Vogel's laugh was harsh. "You collaborated with the enemy while Germany burned. That's not knowledge. That's betrayal." The accusation stung because it contained a grain of truth that Muller could not fully deny. He had cooperated with the Americans, had taught them techniques that might have been used against German soldiers still fighting in the final months of the war. The moral complexity of his position defied simple judgment. But Colonel David Harrison, the British medical administrator who oversaw Hamburg University Hospital, intervened. "Dr. Vogel, that's quite enough. Dr. Muller's credentials have been thoroughly vetted by both American and British authorities. His participation in the medical exchange program demonstrates exactly the kind of international cooperation we need to rebuild German medicine on ethical foundations. If you cannot work constructively with him, I can arrange your transfer to other duties." Vogel left without another word, but his resentment reflected broader tensions Muller would face repeatedly. Many Germans viewed cooperation with occupying forces as collaboration. The concept that such cooperation might serve Germany's long-term interests rather than betraying it was difficult for people traumatized by total defeat to accept. Dr. Weber faced similar challenges at his assignment in Berlin, while Dr. Schmidt encountered resistance in Frankfurt, and young Dr. Hartmann found himself navigating complex politics at a hospital in the American zone of Bavaria. They exchanged letters describing their experiences, supporting each other through the difficult adjustment to a Germany that bore little resemblance to the nation they had left. Muller's first surgical case at Hamburg University Hospital involved a teenage boy named Stefan, who had been injured by unexploded ordnance while scavenging for scrap metal in the ruins. The boy's chest injuries required exactly the kind of advanced thoracic surgery Muller had mastered through the American exchange program. As Muller worked, he was acutely aware of German staff members watching his techniques with a mixture of interest and resentment. The surgery lasted 4 hours. When Muller finally closed and Stefan's vital signs stabilized, one of the assisting nurses, an older woman named Greta who had worked at the hospital since before the war, spoke quietly. "That was remarkable, doctor. I've never seen that approach to repairing a damaged lung. Where did you learn it?" "From an American surgeon named Captain Robert Anderson," Muller answered truthfully. "He developed the technique treating combat injuries." Greta was silent for a moment, then nodded. "Then perhaps some good can come from all this suffering after all." Her words represented a grudging acceptance that would gradually expand over the following months. As Muller's surgical successes accumulated, as patients survived injuries that would have been fatal under previous approaches, the German medical staff began to set aside their resentment in favor of pragmatic recognition that his knowledge was valuable. According to documentation preserved in German medical archives and examined by historians researching post-war medical reconstruction, the integration of POW doctors trained in American facilities proved crucial to rebuilding German medical capacity, despite initial resistance from medical professionals who had remained in Germany throughout the war. Muller also began teaching at the hastily reopened Hamburg Medical School. The student body consisted of young men and women who had lost years to the war, who had seen their education interrupted by military service, bombing campaigns, and the total collapse of German society. They listened to Muller's lectures with desperate intensity, understanding that medical knowledge represented one of the few paths toward building meaningful lives in the ruins. During one lecture on surgical ethics, a student named Friedrich raised his hand. "Professor Muller, how do we trust medical authority after what was done in the camps? How do we know that what you teach us is ethical medicine rather than simply what the occupiers want us to believe?" The question cut to the heart of the crisis facing German medicine. The revelation of medical atrocities at concentration camps, the experiments at Dachau, Auschwitz, Ravensbrück, had shattered trust in medical authority. How could German society rebuild medical institutions when those institutions had so catastrophically betrayed their fundamental purpose? Müller did not offer easy reassurance. "You cannot simply trust authority, Friedrich. Not mine, not any professors, not the states. Medical ethics must be grounded in principles that transcend political convenience: absolute respect for human dignity, informed consent, refusal to participate in harm regardless of orders. I learned these principles not from the Americans imposing them upon us, but from confronting what happened when German physicians abandoned them." He continued, his voice carrying the weight of personal reckoning. "I wore the Wehrmacht uniform. I served a regime that committed unspeakable crimes. I did not participate in those crimes directly, but I kept soldiers alive who may have committed them. I did not resist when resistance was required. You must learn from my failure. Medicine's loyalty must be to humanity first, to the individual patient's welfare, never subordinated to national interest or ideological goals." The students absorbed this in thoughtful silence. They had grown up under Nazi indoctrination, had been taught that loyalty to the Volk and fatherland superseded all other considerations. Muller's teaching represented a fundamental reorientation, placing individual human dignity above collective national identity. That evening, Muller returned to the small apartment he now shared with Anna, located in one of the few intact residential buildings near the hospital. Anna had found work with a British relief organization helping to distribute food and medical supplies to displaced persons. They had fallen into a routine, work during the day, quiet evenings together trying to process the magnitude of change in their lives. "Ernst Vogel came to see me today," Anna said as they shared a modest dinner of bread, cheese, and ersatz coffee. "He wanted me to convince you to be less open about the American training program. He says you're making yourself a target for resentment." Muller set down his cup. "What did you tell him?" "I told him that my husband spent 5 years watching young men die from injuries that proper medical knowledge might have saved. I told him that if the Americans taught you how to save lives, then refusing to share that knowledge would be its own form of betrayal." Anna's eyes met his steadily. "I also told him that Germany lost the war, and we must accept that reality and learn from it rather than clinging to the pride that destroyed us." Muller reached across the table and took her hand. "That took courage." "No more courage than you show every day," Anna replied. "Heinrich, I know this is difficult. I know people judge you for cooperating with the occupiers. But I see the lives you're saving. I see the students who look at you with hope because you represent a path forward. That matters more than the resentment of bitter men like Vogel." Her support sustained Muller through the challenging months ahead. The winter of 1945 to 1946 was brutal. Food remained scarce, fuel for heating was nearly impossible to obtain, and disease spread through the crowded displaced persons camps. The hospital operated at maximum capacity, treating malnutrition, tuberculosis, typhus, and injuries from the hazardous work of clearing rubble and unexploded ordnance. Muller worked 18-hour days, performing surgeries, training younger physicians, teaching medical students, and serving on committees planning the reconstruction of German medical institutions. He maintained correspondence with Captain Anderson and other American physicians he had worked with, exchanging medical journals and discussing cases. These connections kept him current with medical developments and reinforced his commitment to international cooperation in medicine. In March of 1946, Colonel Harrison called Muller to his office. "Dr. Muller, I've received a proposal from the American military government that I wanted to discuss with you personally. They're organizing an international medical conference in Frankfurt for July. The goal is to establish new standards for medical education and ethics in occupied Germany, and they want physicians who participated in the exchange program to present papers on what they learned. Would you be willing to participate?" Muller did not hesitate. "Yes, Colonel. I would be honored." The 16th of July, 1946, brought together over 300 physicians, medical educators, and military administrators at Frankfurt's Palmengarten, one of the few large venues to survive the war relatively intact. Dr. Muller arrived by train from Hamburg, traveling through a landscape still scarred by conflict, burned-out tanks rusting in fields, bombed bridges showing temporary repairs, refugee camps dotting the countryside. The journey took 12 hours through what had once been a 4-hour trip, but Muller used the time to review his presentation notes and reflect on how profoundly his understanding of medicine had evolved since his capture 14 months earlier. The conference facility bustled with activity as delegates from all 4 occupation zones converged. American, British, French, and Soviet representatives, along with German physicians from various regions. The atmosphere crackled with tension as former enemies navigated the awkward reality of collaboration. Muller spotted Captain Anderson across the registration hall and felt genuine joy at seeing his friend and mentor again. Anderson embraced him warmly. "Heinrich, you look well. I've read the reports about your work in Hamburg. Impressive surgical outcomes given the resource limitations." "I had an excellent teacher," Muller replied, smiling. "Your techniques have saved many lives." They were joined by Dr. Weber, who had traveled from Berlin, and Dr. Schmidt from Frankfurt. Young Dr. Hartmann could not attend. He was performing an emergency surgery in Munich and sent his regrets. The reunion of the German doctors who had shared the American experience felt significant, a small community bound by their unique perspective on former enemies becoming colleagues. The conference opened with remarks from General Lucius Clay, the American military governor of Germany, whose words set an unexpectedly conciliatory tone. We gather here not to punish German medicine, but to rebuild it. The medical profession in Germany failed catastrophically when it allowed itself to become an instrument of state murder. But medicine itself, the ancient art of healing, the commitment to alleviating suffering, remains sacred. Our task is to ensure that German medicine reconnects with those fundamental values while incorporating modern scientific advances. The general's speech acknowledged both the necessity of reckoning with past crimes and the possibility of redemption through commitment to ethical practice. Müller found himself moved by the balanced approach, neither vengeful nor naive, recognizing complexity while maintaining moral clarity. The first day included presentations on rebuilding medical infrastructure, establishing new standards for medical education, and implementing ethical guidelines based on principles being developed for the upcoming Nuremberg medical trials. Dr. Leo Alexander, a psychiatrist and neurologist who was serving as an investigator for the Nuremberg trials, delivered a sobering presentation on the medical atrocities documented at concentration camps. Alexander's detailed account of experiments conducted on prisoners, hypothermia studies at Dachau, high-altitude experiments, deliberate infection with typhus and malaria, left the audience in horrified silence. Müller had read reports of these crimes, but hearing the systematic documentation from an investigator who had interviewed survivors and examined records made the horror immediate and undeniable. These were not isolated acts by a few criminals, Alexander concluded. They represented the logical endpoint of a medical philosophy that subordinated individual welfare to perceived collective interests, that categorized human beings as more or less worthy of care and dignity, based on racial and political classifications. The German medical profession must confront how it arrived at this catastrophic failure. During the break following Alexander's presentation, Müller encountered Dr. Ernst Vogel, the Hamburg surgeon who had initially treated him with hostility. Vogel looked shaken, his face ashen. "I did not know," he said quietly, more to himself than to Müller. "I knew there were camps, knew that Jews and political prisoners were treated harshly, but I did not imagine, could not have imagined." Müller chose his words carefully. "The question is what we do with this knowledge now, how we ensure it never happens again." Vogel met his eyes. "Perhaps you were right. Perhaps learning from the Americans, accepting their oversight and their ethical frameworks, is not collaboration, but necessity. We clearly cannot trust ourselves." The admission represented a painful recognition that would become increasingly common among German physicians over the following years, the understanding that German medicine had to be fundamentally reformed rather than simply restored to pre-Nazi conditions. Müller's presentation came on the second day of the conference. He spoke about thoracic surgical techniques learned through the American exchange program, demonstrating with detailed diagrams and case studies how these approaches improved survival rates for trauma injuries. But he also spoke about professional ethics, about the relationship between technical competence and moral integrity. "Medicine is not morally neutral," Müller argued. "Technical skill without ethical grounding produces monsters." The Nazi doctors who conducted experiments possessed sophisticated medical knowledge. They were highly educated, technically proficient. What they lacked was the moral foundation that should govern all medical practice. As we rebuild German medicine, we must emphasize ethics alongside technique, ensuring that every physician understands their primary loyalty must be to the individual patient's welfare, never to state ideology or collective abstractions. According to records maintained by the Allied Control Council, and later examined by historians researching post-war medical reform, this conference marked a turning point in how occupation authorities approached rebuilding German medical institutions, shifting from purely punitive oversight toward collaborative reconstruction based on shared ethical principles. Captain Anderson presented immediately after Müller, discussing the American military's experience integrating German POW physicians into medical practice. He described the initial skepticism within American medical ranks, the gradual recognition that cooperation produced better outcomes than isolation, and the development of teaching programs that facilitated knowledge transfer between former enemies. The medical exchange program succeeded because it recognized a fundamental truth, Anderson said. Medicine is a universal human endeavor that transcends national boundaries. The German physicians we worked with were not the enemy. They were colleagues who had been trapped in an enemy nation's military. By treating them as skilled professionals rather than criminals, we gained access to valuable knowledge while also demonstrating that former enemies could work together productively. During the question period, a French military physician raised a skeptical concern. Captain Anderson, doesn't your approach risk rehabilitating individuals who supported a criminal regime? How do you distinguish between physicians who were merely conscripted versus those who genuinely supported Nazi ideology? Anderson's response was measured. We conducted thorough background investigations. We excluded anyone with evidence of war crimes or willing participation in atrocities. But we also recognized that most German military physicians were simply trying to do their jobs under difficult circumstances. Collective guilt, treating all Germans as equally culpable, would be both unjust and counterproductive. We need to rebuild German society, and that requires working with Germans of goodwill. The exchange captured the central tension of the occupation period, balancing accountability for past crimes with the practical necessity of reconstruction. Too much emphasis on punishment would make rebuilding impossible. Too little would fail to address the moral catastrophe that had occurred. That evening, a reception brought together conference participants in informal conversation. Muller found himself in discussion with Dr. Alexander, the Nuremberg investigator, along with several other German physicians who had spent the war in various circumstances, some in military service like Müller, others in civilian practice, one who had spent 3 years in a concentration camp for political opposition. Dr. Thomas Braun, the physician who had been imprisoned for opposing the regime, spoke with quiet intensity. I lost colleagues to the camps, physicians who refused to cooperate with eugenic sterilization programs or who treated Jewish patients despite prohibitions. Some of you served the Wehrmacht, kept the army functioning. I do not judge. Most had no choice, and treating wounded soldiers is legitimate medical practice. But as we rebuild, we must remember those who resisted, who paid the ultimate price for maintaining ethical integrity. Muller felt the implicit rebuke. You are right, Dr. Braun. We must honor those who resisted, but we must also find a path forward.